just built Pontiac engines, amongst selling parts, and I'll go through a little bit of my boring accomplishments. But before I start, actually, since we're in Gettysburg, PA, I'm a Pennsylvania native from both sides of my family. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that connection first, and then I'll get into some of the other things. So I had a really good buddy who was a really great racer. His name was Bill Banks, and as he used to say, I'm a legend in my own mind. So I'm a legend in my own mind as well. So just want a little shout out to a guy in heaven right now. So since I am a proud Pennsylvanian, my first show ever that I ever did was the 1988 convention that was in Downtown. If I showed pictures on there, you would never ever want to speak to me again because I looked horrendous. I had cut off jeans. I even had a cut off shirt. And I'm like, oh my God, how did I dress like this? And it was funny. My girlfriend at the time was pregnant and I was selling parts, and I was sat between Chris Casperson and Dennis Kerbin. And here I am, this little, I don't know what you want to call it, a little Pennsylvania hick almost, basically selling parts to get a wedding ring. So that's how I started my selling of Pontiac parts. The Spots family actually goes back to Pennsylvania to the 1600s. It's a funny name, you know, I get a lot of jokes sometimes. It's spelled S-P-O-T-T-S, but the name was actually changed, and we don't know when, somewhere in the 1700s. So it's a German, actually my family would say Pennsylvania Dutch name, and they have some funny names, don't they? I mean, you've heard some of the towns here, I'm not even gonna go over that, but there are some really silly names in the Pennsylvania Dutch world. So I guess I'm one of them. So you can tell me any joke, you know, thick skin, so I'm okay with that. So my grandparents are from Millersburg, and my father's actually buried there. I lost him about 3 years ago, and he loved going to the racetrack with me. Even though he wasn't a car guy, we were very close to, and he would go to Norwalk, which I'll be going next week for the big race there, the big Pontiac event there. Anyway, the name was actually spelled S-P-A-T-Z, and in German that's pronounced Spots. So the only thing I can think of is they did a census, they were farmers, I don't think they could read or write, and they just put that name down because that's what it sounded like. So that is a possibility. There was a general in World War II, and my lovely wife Agnes is over here, and her father lives with us, who's 99 and a half, and was in World War II. And the connection there is that this general in World War II was from Boyertown, Pennsylvania, which is very close to where we're from. We're from Hatfield, PA. I'm originally from Philadelphia. Anyway, this general, his name was Tooey Spots, S-P-A-A-T-Z. And I'm a real historian. One of the things I love about Pontiacs is the nostalgia part. And I love what Tim Dye's doing, by the way. I mean, every time I get the smoke signals now, I'm very excited to read the history, real history nut. So I ended up finding out there's a general in World War II that's not far from where I live. He has red hair. I used to have red hair. Somehow it's gone. I don't know what happened to it. And a lot of it is missing from my 3 daughters. So anyway, I'm talking to her father, Jim, who, by the way, very first car was a 1931 Pontiac. So I mean, it was just meant to be. So I'm telling him about there's this general, and he said, I served him in the mess hall in England in World War II. So I thought that was really cool.
Wow.
So I'm like, hey, that's my family. Of course it isn't, but I just want to say that so I have this link. But maybe we are, we don't know. But his wife and daughters urged him to change their name from S-P-A-T-Z to S-P-A-A-T-Z because S-P-A-T-Z sounds like spats. And that must have been unpleasant for a nice lady. Please don't spit on me. Anyway, there are 3 spots that's buried in Gettysburg. I just found that out 3 weeks ago from my cousin Alan's spots. So I told him that I was coming out here to speak in Gettysburg, and he said, oh, it's just there, it's just at the battlefield. And I cannot believe I've never been here before. Oh, wow. So this will be something that we're going to do after my boring speech here. So hopefully it won't be boring. The other side of me is Italian. So as you can see, the hands are going. And really I owe a lot to my Uncle Ron, who is the car guy in the family. And to pay him back, I'll mention that he's selling a 61 Tempest wagon and smoke signals. Okay, there, Ron, we're videoing this, so there you go, Ron. Took care of you. He's overpriced on it, by the way.
Thank you.
He did lower it by his nephew's suggestion.
Yeah, I think I know which one.
I'm sure if you looked in this, you'll see it there. So please buy it. Anyway, just kidding. How I started really was he took me to Carlisle. My grandfather was ill on my Italian side. He lives in Texas. He moved from Philadelphia to Texas. And he's one of those half Eagles, half Cowboys fans. So he has a lot of issues, as you could imagine. That's just wrong right there. You just can't be both. So anyway, he took me to Carlisle. In 1979, that's when I joined the POCI, so I've been an on and off again POCI member for 40 years now. So when they sent that thing out that says the members, I'm like looking for my name, and I'm like, oh, I guess I let a subscription go, and I'm not on that 40-year list. So let's get that reinstated, please. But if you don't have to, that's okay. Anyway, he took me to Carlisle. I had a 68 Firebird overhead cam Sprint, and it was a beautiful car. I paid $200 for it because I was poor. 1979, I was 17 years old. I worked at a Pizza Hut as a dishwasher. So that's how my Pontiac career started. I actually test drove this car, not because I wanted to buy it. It had a for sale sign. I just saw it had a 4-speed in it, and what was this thing on the hood? And these long letters, overhead cam, 4.1 liter. So I just needed to drive that car. I taught myself how to drive 4-speed for my parents' Volkswagen and just watched them. So I really knew what to do. So I test drove this car from a cook at Pizza Hut, and I blew the engine up.
Nice.
First time. He told me to get on it, and it had a rod knock, so he knew the engine was going. So I fell in love with the car. I could not believe that when I turned the lights on, it was at night, and this thing lit up, and it was the speedometer that said 160 miles an hour. And at the time, I had a 69 Impala, so everything was 120. And right there, I was like hooked, like, oh my God. And then the hood tack lit up, and it worked. So the tack's working, and right there, I became a Pontiac life member, basically. I could not afford to buy the car since I was a dishwasher, so he agreed to let me have $20 a week. So it took me 10 weeks to pay that $200 off, while it sat on a side road where we pushed it off from me blowing the engine. So that was crazy. And even a cop came up and saw what was going on, because not only did I blow the motor, I exploded the engine, where pieces were flying out from under the hood, and there were sparks and fire and an oil trail. And today, now that I'm an engine builder, I'm like, oh my gosh, yeah, that was a connecting rod. There's a piece of the block, piece of the alternator. I mean, I blew it up. And this cop came over, and thank God an overhead cam is not allowed. He was like, oh my God, I thought Iranians came in and bombed. So that was during the Iranian crisis, if any of you history persons know about it. So that's my little Pennsylvania, and then I went off on a tangent. So I'll give you the boring rest of my Pontiac history. So like I said, in '79, I became a member because of me having that car. I ended up finding an engine in a local junkyard, and I built my first motor at 17 from a Children's magazine. So that's how I was self-taught engine builder. I had a lot of help in between. because I got into the Firebird, my uncle took me to Carlisle. I basically started a company called Rarebird Firebird Parts. If you have any early 80s smoke signals, you'll see some ads of mine in there. And I sold 67 to 9 Firebird parts. And I was always said I was a rare bird, so I named my business Rarebird. And I made no money at all. But it was fun, and I really loved it, and it started a career. And I had some services. I chromed bumpers. I found a company, K.I.T.T, which is another Pennsylvania company with chrome bumpers. And I would, at that point, I started buying early Firebirds, and I bought these things for $100, $50. I mean, those things are so gone. I mean, the cars I bought for parts cars are now restoration projects for $5,000.
That's right.
So it's crazy how things have changed. So then, from the early 80s to 89, that business was merged into performance years. I had met Chris Casperson, another local person, at a car show. He had a GTO. I ended up having about another 3 Firebirds after the overhead cam car, which I ended up putting a 400 into. But I'll tell about that later. So Chris had met me at the show, and then a few years later he started performance years. I worked at an auto parts store, so I had a lot of parts experience. And when he started his business, it took off right away. This was 1989, and he needed help, and he remembered me and called me up. And at the time, I was a manager at a parts store, and I had a girlfriend and a baby girl. My oldest daughter, now Rachel, who's now 30 years old, so that's so hard to really put that in there. And all he did when I answered the phone was he went, "Help." And I'm like, "Well, who is this?" And then next thing you know, I said, as long, I will do it, I'll take the chance and work with you as long as I can be some type of, have some type of ownership. So I merged my Rarebird Firebird parts into performance years. So I basically was the Firebird end of performance years since Chris was the GTO. And then the other really cool thing was, because I worked in the parts industry, I worked at basically 2 different places that one would call me back and I would go back. So I ended up working in Hatboro, Pennsylvania. And if anyone from the area knows, that's where Dennis Kerbin is right near. And I had already known Dennis, you know, he was very famous at the time. And unfortunately, I don't think I ever told him, is he here by chance? Good, okay, he is not. So I knew where he got all of his parts. I knew where he got all of his stuff because I had it at the time, back in '89, I was driving a 65 Tempest that was bright yellow. It was a full-blown race car on the street. And because that car would be parked out, it brought in a lot of Pontiac people, which today I'm sure a lot of you people meet other people because of your car. You know, there's a connection. So people would come in there, "Oh, I work at H&R Radio, Dennis Kerbin gets all of his speakers here." Click, stay in the memory bank. So I was a big asset to Chris because everything we were buying from Kerbin, I said, I know where he gets this from, I know where he gets that from. So then we started wholesaling a lot of the stuff like Dennis did. So that's where the wholesale part of performance years had come in. Let's see, I'm still working there. A lot of people do not know that. So performance years was sold to Ames Performance, I think about 5 years ago. And before that, Chris made me an offer I couldn't refuse. So I basically worked 25 hours a week there. I work basically Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday. And I get to set my own hours. He gives me full-time benefits, and it's worked out quite well, even though I really need to quit there and go full-time engine building because I'm over a year booked with engine work right now. But I promised my wife I would not leave that job because of all the other benefits. So, I'll tell you some of my Pontiac accomplishments. For High Performance Pontiac Magazine, which is no longer there, which is very sad to me, I used to be one of the tech Q&A writers, so I would do a lot of tech articles, mostly about engine work, since I specialized in that. I've had several articles. I see how I'm already embellishing myself. I said many, but it's just like probably like 4 articles published. I would write a few articles. I got a really nice relationship with Rich Lintonello, who was the editor at the time, and then Tom DeMauro, who was his protege. And both gentlemen are in Hemmings now. And I got to be friends with them, and because of my Performance Years connection, it was a real nice relationship. There's a very famous Pontiac engine book that Jim Hand wrote called, actually I forget the name, How to Build Pontiac V8s. And I was one of the contributors to that, and a lot of photographs and articles, and 2 recipes he wanted, like a street engine and a race engine type recipe. So that book is now not published anymore. And when my father passed away, I found a copy I gave him and went on eBay and saw that these books are over $100 now. I could not believe it. It's $169. So I said, I'm going to autograph one and put it on there, and I sold it. And I think that gentleman is here today, so thank you so much for that purchase of that. I helped produce over 200 Pontiac reproduction parts, and that is with Performance Years mainly, and then now with me it's Spots Performance. I produced some parts there. A lot of it was helping Chris with the GTO, and then I would find certain items that I'm like, oh my gosh, look, people are asking about that. One of the nice things when you're answering the phone every day is you get to hear what people want. So we would actually look into doing a lot of it. So today, at the current Performance Years, which is now Max Performance, and a little tidbit is that's Chris's first grandson's name is Max. So that's where the name came from. After he had sold the retail business to Ames, he kept the wholesale business, and one of the wholesale items is locks. So a lot of your Pontiacs, if you bought locks from Ames, if you bought locks from Original Parts Group, if you bought them on eBay, a lot of times that came from the old Performance Years. And that is a whole other story, but I also do locks. I'm a self-taught locksmith, and I just found a source in Philadelphia that had a lot of new old stocks, and that's where Ames was getting their locks. So all the early locks were all new old stock, and they all came out of a warehouse in Philadelphia, and the lady was in her 80s and taught me how to be a locksmith over the phone. Wow. And that's what I do over there now. So there's still a lock division. No one really knows about it because it's wholesale. We don't advertise, but we sell Ford, Chevy, Mopar, and just muscle car and classic car locks. The biggest is the Mustang and the 55-7 Chevy. We sell thousands of dollars of locks a week. It's amazing. So that's the other, what I'm doing basically part-time. So that's off the Pontiac deal, but I just figured I'd mention it. I kind of like wrote some stuff down and I already talked about it, so that's pretty weird that it just happens that way. I go off on tangents. One of the things I'll do is a tech question and answer, if anyone has any questions or whatever, and I'll save that for later. So back to what I do now is Spots Performance. I basically just build Pontiac engines, and I will build anything from a completely stock engine to a blown 1,000+ horsepower blown alcohol, which I used to run one of those. I really enjoy both. I love to do stock engines. One of the last stock engines I built was for a 69 Firebird 350 HO that was built out in California, and they think it's one of one. And it's the the only 350 engine I've ever built. I've always steered people away from building them because you can build a 400 engine for less money and have more performance. So the only time I really did one was just a restoration. And supposedly that car is here today, so we need to see it. I'm gonna drink a little bit of water. My first engine, like I mentioned, was an overhead cam, and I never built another one until a few years ago. And unfortunately, we lost. He was a friend. We became really good friends, and his name was Chris Burley. And he contacted me if I was interested in doing an overhead cam engine for his 31 Pontiac. And first of all, I love street rods. I love original, and I'm one of those people that just appreciates both. I know some people hate when somebody makes a street rod out of an early Pontiac, and I get that, because I really appreciate the history. So Chris contacted me to do an overhead cam motor, which I did, and I got the pleasure of driving the car, and unfortunately we lost him a few months ago from the flu of all things. So you'll see that car up for sale. His wife has it right now, and he really got to, first of all, a true Pontiac guy. He also had other Pontiacs too, and he got to build a car that became best of show in a lot of magazines. So just another little heaven shout out right there. I've owned over 50, 67, and 9 Firebirds, mostly parts cars. So I've had the pleasure of owning a 1 of 8 Ram Air 2 convertible that I took a loan to buy, and I ended up just selling it and bought a house from the profits. So Pontiac's also been very good to me. That car is still in Pennsylvania, Glen Mills, PA. The guy that I sold it to still has it, has a collection of Ram Air Firebirds. And that is my favorite car, by the way. Back in '79, as I got into learning about the early Firebirds, I found out how rare they were. My business was called Rare Bird Firebird Parts, you know. So it was really cool that I actually owned one at one time. And I would probably never own another one because they are getting way out of sight. I've owned several race cars. My actual first car, I ended up selling the overhead cam for a guy that was restoring one of those cars, and he had put a 400 in his Firebird, and I ended up getting that 400, and he gave me money, and he put the car in, and he taught me how to build my first V8. So he was a mechanic. His brother was a big Pontiac family, and I got to go to his house, and I mean, we did the old school lapping the valves in, and boy, I'll tell you, and I called him a couple of years ago, because at Max Performance and Pipes, we had our local show that we didn't have this year, and I called him up to bring that Firebird over to the show, and I thanked him for my career. So I'm all about thanking anyone that has helped me get to where I am today. So the thing that really put me on the map is an unfortunate story. My first 68, actually I went a lot, but the first one I raced was a blue 68 Firebird, and on Halloween night 1986 it caught on fire at the end of the track, and it burnt to the ground. It would not go out. They came up with fire extinguishers, and because it was Halloween, it was very weird because the car, this is perfect for Gettysburg because I'm finding out there's ghosts everywhere. Well, I had a ghost of my own in Acton, New Jersey, so the car burnt and all the electrical burned. So the lights went on and off, the horn went on and off. It was very eerie. And this is at the end of the racetrack. I'm by myself. It's all very quiet and just the woods right there. They came down with fire extinguishers, and that car just burned. It threw a flame out of the hood scoop at my face when I tried to open the hood, and I just ran away. And then I was running, I'm like, oh my God, my car's on fire. I was like, so I ran back, and he threw another flame in my face. I was like, okay, burn. So my friend Chuck is here, and he, at the time, was partners with Chris Casperson of Performance Years. and had a body shop and let me bring the car to his shop, the burnt Hulk, and I was able to salvage the engine, transmission, and the rear, which ended up becoming some purchases and trades for other cars. Thanks, Chuck.
My pleasure.
And Chuck has a 70 GTO Judge convertible, the real one here. So he's a big Pontiac guy himself. So after that car, I had met my friend and I opened up with Bill Banks, who, when we were at Performance Years, we sponsored his 64 GTO called the Bop and Bear. And that car sat for 30 years and was just bought recently by Jim Polino, who surprised me and brought it to Norwalk a couple of years ago. And it was in Linder's lot where you all pull in, and there's the car that I helped build with, mostly with parts, and then going to the races, going to the GTO Nationals, going to POCIs, whatever there was racing involved, and even shows too, just displaying it. And when Jim pulled up, I was with my wife and all, and I actually lost it. I just started crying because I love this guy. He was just super cool. So that is really cool that that car is now back out and he's racing it. So it's pretty neat. And the car was local to our area. It was a Pennsylvania car, Telford, PA. And it had a rare bathtub intake manifold that he borrowed from Arnie Bestwick and then eventually bought it from Arnie. I think Arnie was going to come here.
He's here.
He is here. I have to give a shout out to him. I have a lot of Arnie stories. I won't bore you with too many. But first of all, like an idol of mine as a young guy getting into performance, and here's this icon. And I got to, when we were at Performance Years, I got a chance to actually meet him because Chris has done many businesses. And he did these things called muscle cards, which were baseball cards of cars. So you'll see them once in a while. I think Ames sold them, and we contacted Arnie to do it. So I got to talk to him on the phone, and I'm still like get a little starstruck with stuff because in my mind I know I'm old now, but my mind thinks I'm still like this 17-year-old kid. So I don't know if any of you guys experience it. So it's just no.
No, that's right.
What was that? I don't remember anything.
There you go. So the first time I actually, because I talked to him on the phone, and I thought that was super, super neat, I went to a Pontiac event in Lebanon Valley, and I had my 69 Firebird at the time. The one that burnt to the ground, I replaced with a 69, and then I was with Performance Years then, so it was sponsored. So it was really great. I got to have them. I wasn't a very rich guy, so I had to basically, my car was paid for by sponsors, so it was stickered up pretty good. So I go to Lebanon Valley, and at the time there was a company called Indian Adventures, and it was Dick Duclos, who now is retired in Florida, and he started this Pontiac race event in Lebanon Valley. That's a 5-hour trip from where I'm at. And back then, in the early 90s, oh my gosh, if there was a Pontiac event, it didn't matter, we went, because it was so far and few between. So I go all the way up there, drive 5 hours, and I'm like, I'll get the race gas at the racetrack. They don't sell race fuel. I drive 5 hours, I had no race fuel to race. And I'm like, oh my God, what am I gonna do? And they were just like, yeah, we don't have fuel here. And I'm like, what racetrack doesn't have fuel? So that was just devastating. I'm thinking I just drove 5 hours and I'm not gonna do anything. So I walk over, there's Marnie, and he's got his Tameless Tiger GTO, and I introduce myself, and hey, Paul. I'm like, yeah, I just came here, they don't have any fuel. There's 5 gallons right there, take it. I'm like, take it? No. He was gonna give me 5 gallons of race fuel. And I thought that was, right there I became a super fan. So, so throughout the years, I would see him at Norwalk. I was involved in a project of a car that was basically like a clone car or a tribute car called the Righteous Judge. that I got to deal with him a lot with that. And I got to race it, build the car, build the engine, and then get to race it in Norwalk. And I raced against Marty, so that was a big deal for me. Last year they had the GTO Nationals at Oaks, PA, which is near us. So I went for the day, and there's Arnie with a gentleman pulling in, and it was such a pleasure. I helped him pull the race car out and get it in his spot. So that's my little Arnie connection. So after my '69 Firebird, that was stolen on my birthday. And it is just another story out there. And I raced that car quite successfully at all the Pontiac events. And after it was stolen, I ended up getting insurance money from the place it was stolen from. And I bought a dragster. It was a gentleman in New Jersey called Mike Cam. It was a '68 front engine dragster with a giant blower, alcohol, and I had to have it. It had no transmission. So what I did was, since I had a '69 Firebird, I was always a Firebird guy, a car fell in my lap, and I ended up buying a Project '69 Firebird. It's actually a shame they made it a race car. It was a real 400 air-conditioned car from California. So there's no rust. If you ever go to the track and see me, take a look at the frame. It's perfect condition, rust-free California car from a lady, and I have all the documentation of all of her receipts. So unfortunately, a guy in Michigan already cut it up. So that car is what I race now. So it's basically a '69 Trans Am, and I wanted to do giant wheelies with it. And I got my wish one day at ACO, and I put it up on the back balance panel and had all 4 tires off the ground. And I opened my eyes on that one because I wasn't ready for that. So I was looking straight up at the sky. And I know that you're not supposed to lift because you don't want your car to slam down. So I shifted into second gear, and the car went all the way up to the rev limiter at over 7,000 RPMs, which they say you can't rev a Pontiac. Yes, you can. And the car was in second gear, 7,500 RPMs, and I said, something's wrong, I'm not coming down. I let out, and it did smash down, but I didn't ruin the car. I just smashed the headers, and I still am racing it after welding up some headers and replacing some lower control arm snubbers. They saved me. So, that's pretty much the Pontiac accomplishments. And the other thing I wanted to talk about is fake news, which is basically a lot of stuff that you will hear. And with my 40 years experience with engines, and every time I build an engine, I actually examine every part of it. I examine the casting numbers, I examine the cavity casting numbers, the date codes, and I've seen a pattern, and I have seen what Pontiac has done throughout the years. So the first thing I'll talk about is, if you're a Pontiac person, you never say small block or big block.
That's right.
So thank you for, can I get an amen?
Amen.
I'm a big social media person. I don't advertise, by the way, for my business. I have no ads. I have no phone number. You can't call me. I only email, and I'm on Facebook. That's it. I had to do that because of my other job. So if you try to call me, I apologize if you couldn't get a hold of me. And if you don't have email, I apologize. But I had to do what I had to do. I got tired of answering the phone and selling. I still sell parts. I sell a lot of parts I make, and I sell cams and lifters for original and performance parts. But I also had to deal with people that would talk to me for an hour. And I know I'm my own worst enemy. So I also engage and try to help people out. But I was also realizing that people were sitting in their underwear selling parts on eBay and not dealing with the phone. And I'm like, I'm doing something wrong. So I joined that crowd. And yes, I am in my underwear. Sometimes. Because I wake up and I go go to my computer, what did I sell today? Sometimes I just didn't get ready yet for the day. So sorry for that image. I will get rid of that. So anyway, one of the other parts of fake news or misinformation is a lot of people will call pistons high compression pistons. In the Pontiac world, there's no such thing. All the Pontiac's compression were done by the cylinder heads. And what made Pontiac one of the better companies and what made their engines fantastic is they machined the combustion chamber size. So a lot of times they would cast a cylinder head and they would machine it a different volume. So that is where your compression changed. Everything else was flat top pistons. So that's almost back to the fake news part where people would say a big block or a small block. That's your Chevy, Ford, Chrysler mentality, which is incorrect in our world. And of course, if you didn't know, all Pontiacs are the same size, cubic inches by bore and stroke. The other thing that I hear a lot of that's fake is you need to make high compression to make power, and you do not. There's so many engines I build today that make 500 horsepower and only are 9-to-1 compression. It can run on 87 octane. So a lot of that has to do with efficiency, camshaft selection, and the rest of the combination. Another thing people would say, Pontiacs have a bad oiling system. And I think I know where that came from, since I've done some early Pontiac V8s. The earliest I've done is 59, but I have parts for 55 to 57, and I've actually examined the oil pumps and other things. The early Pontiac oil pumps actually floated. They didn't just sit there fixed.
Right.
So they would actually move up and down. And I'm like, that wasn't a good idea. So maybe that came down because some things you can I don't know, sometimes people will say something like, well, that was back then. It's not like that now. But that bad rumor steam will stick around and like the whisper down the lane. The other thing that made the oiling system not as good in the early motors is the way that they put oil up top and oil the rocker arms. The early Pontiacs were fed and oiled through the rocker arm studs. So it had to really do a lot of traveling. It came from 2 cam bearings that were pressurized. And that means when your motor was shut off and you first started it, it had to get all that pressure to come back before it got the oiling up at the top. And of course, Pontiac engineers were also one of my heroes. They always found things, just like every other engine manufacturer, and improved it. So they basically discontinued that, and just in time for the GTO. So the 64 GTO did not get the studs oiled, but the 64 full-size Pontiacs did. So there was a difference in those blocks. You can get a block, which I've done. I have one in my car. My 69 Firebird right now is a 63 421 in it because I couldn't sell it. It was bored, somebody stamped it 1,000,000 times. It was just not desirable, so I used it. And I blocked those 2 ports off from the cam bearings with pipe plugs. And it's just like a regular Pontiac newer engine now. All the other Pontiacs, of course, are fed through the push rods from the lifters. The 55 Pontiac has its own lifter. And I actually have them on eBay. I have a lot of new old stock ones. I buy up any V8 engine part I can. I have a guy that cleans out warehouses, and for years he would be coming over. I told him, I'm done. I don't need any more 1957 bearings for, or 347 parts. I don't sell any of that stuff. And I've never built a motor for one yet. Another thing that's fake, and I may get arguments on this, but I have proof, is a lot of people would say that the Ram Air engines, so the Ram Air Pontiacs, the true Ram Air that started out in 67, they did have a 66, but they actually had a different casting number in 67. A lot of people would say that they have a high nickel content. And of all my examinations of blocks, that is untrue. I had a 69 Ram Air 4 engine in my shop, and a real one, because there's a lot of fake ones out there. And I had a 1969 2-barrel 400 block. They both came out of the exact same mold, because Pontiac, the casting not only was the same, but they put the cavities. So if they had a mold, which were made of sand, and they poured the cast iron into that mold, they labeled each mold with a number. One as high as 15, I have found. There might be higher numbers, but that's what I've seen. So that means that this casting was number 1, number 2, number 3. Maybe the castings went bad and they would come out with a new one. And they put a little clock on every block. And that clock had 2 dots at the top, which were 12 o'clock. So you knew what time the motor was actually made. Excuse me a second. This is what I was afraid of. They put D and an N, and they had a little arrow, and they would unscrew a screw in the mold, and it would either go to day or night shift. So you knew if an engine was built almost to the hour of every day, and they did it in 3 shifts. Think about the hundreds of thousands of cars they're making, and a lot of people don't know this either, but they didn't have one casting company. There were several. So I could have 2 68 blocks side by side, and you could tell that they were 2 different, complete different castings. And I haven't figured it all out, but I've talked to a few people. I share a lot of information. I'm friends with many, many other people that build engines and just all kinds of Pontiac guys. And there's some better castings than other. And one of the things that people think, even though I have a 63 421, from porting cylinder heads, deflashing casting, the early cast iron is not as good as the 70s cast iron. So even with technology, and casting is an art, and the mixture, the nickel, I mean, it's a precision art. It has to flow, and I have had so many defects that I can't believe even Pontiac let some of these motors go out, where casting wasn't even all in one area. But if it's sealed water, and it's sealed combustion chamber, they were able to machine all this stuff, they let it go through, because it's a production car. So that's pretty much most of the fake news. And if anyone has any questions, I can do some questions. I kind of opened up the door. Yes, sir.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Go
Oh,
ahead.
sorry, I didn't see you.
No. What's the story behind the lifters, the hot ball lifters?
Okay, so that's a great question. 69 Ram Air 4. I don't know if 68 Ram Air 2 actually, I think, may have had the first with a forged crank in that. But what they did on the lifters, knowing that this motor was going to get revved, mind you, the cars came with 390 or 433 gears. Can you imagine driving a car with those gears, with short tires? 60 miles an hour, you're 3,000 RPMs.
That's right.
And for hours going to the shore, going to the mountains.
The
So
speed
what
limit.
they did as a race motor, a ball inside of a lifter is basically a metering. So the lifters are metered with oil. And if you get a lifter and it's completely empty of oil and you can push down on it, there's a certain amount of travel that it'll push down to meter that oil. On the Ram Air 4s, they limited that travel. So even with the lower oil pressure at idle, it wouldn't be as low. If you think about this, when a lifter is pushed down, a hydraulic lifter, which most of us have in our cars, at an idle, you do not have your full cam lift because your lifter is now down further. Your rocker arm is not opening the valve as deep. So on an idle, your engine has less lift. So on a larger lift engine with a lot of cam lift, your engine has less performance at idle. You don't need it at idle, and it'll let it behave better. Well, the high ball lifter gave you more consistent high lift.
was the oil hose in a different position? When I built my 400, the lifters that came out, I got actually OEM lifters.
GM lifters.
GM lifters.
Yep.
Guy called them highball lifters. He said, this is for the 69 GTO. And I noticed that the oil hole's in a different position.
And the size.
And size.
Yes, because of metering. And today, this day, on all my performance engines, I do not use them. Because they're twice the price and you do not need them. So, but it was something they did in 1969. So with today's modern camshafts, even if I'm using an old school Ram Air 4, I still don't put them in there because I concentrate on good oil pressure. So as soon as your pressure is gone, you're full lift, even at 1,500 RPMs. And all the engines I build, I'm not building a 6,000 RPM engine for a street car. So they're just not used as common today. Some people would swear, I mean, you'll always get someone that'll argue my point, but it was a better part. I think I've used one set in the last 400 engines.
So you can put those in a non-Ram Air engine?
You can, absolutely. It's just, you don't need to spend that money. Most of the time I'm doing engines, I'm also trying not to charge, crazy prices, just, if you don't need something, if somebody wants it, I would definitely do it. But usually after I talk to them, oh, okay, don't worry about it. Joe?
Well, I'll start with the general and get to a specific.
Sure, go ahead.
But not near as technical as that. I've got a 56 watt.
Okay.
400 engine.
Okay.
That it came with.
Right.
I believe it's around 71 engine.
That would be very important because that's a big difference.
Like
Those 2 years are a huge difference, but go ahead.
Okay, so I need to get behind that distributor despite my back. Right?
Yes,
But anyway.
or you don't have to go back by the distributor. You need to identify the cylinder heads. Doesn't matter what your block is. So that's a great, I'm glad you brought that up. It does not matter most of the time when you're identifying a Pontiac of the block. The cylinder heads are everything. Like I told you earlier, that's where the compression. So 1970 is high compression, 1971 is low compression. So you could have a 68 block with 71 heads. Your motor's a 71, because that's where your compression, which I don't know if I touched on all of that. Matter of fact, they did, and I skipped that. But finish your question and I'll go off on my little tangent.
Well, I want to end up with around 500 horsepower. And I'm trying to decide, should I have that 400 built to that or go for a 455?
Great question. And this is what I do most of the finishing.
Well, I'll just add on.
Okay.
And another builder told I said I'd like to have tri-power, because my old car.
Yep.
And he says, yeah, we can do that, but it's going to be harder to make power because the intake manifolds, or the heads, are not going to be as big.
Yep.
Okay.
So,
Please respond.
if you were dealing with me and we figured out your 2 cylinder heads, I have 2 recipes. So the first one is, I do a lot of stroker motors. Some people have different opinions on that. So 90% of the people that come up to me, and 500 horsepower is the big number right now for people. I'm doing one right now. Matter of fact, 2 days ago, I just put the bottom end together. And what I do with 400, most of the 400 blocks, is I stroke them. So they make what's called an eagle stroker crank, and it gets your 400 and it becomes a 461. It's the least expensive way to build 500 horsepower because now you've just basically made your engine more than a 455 with the change of the crankshaft. That crankshaft also has specific parts, connecting rods and pistons that go with it. So let's say you have the 71 400, and those would be number 96 heads. So you want to find your casting number. 96 heads are excellent for a 461 stroker motor. To get 500 horse with tri-power, it'll get expensive because you'll then need to get your heads ported, because you need to have a lot more airflow from those heads, and you would need a roller cam. There's some hydraulic cams that can get you that power, but now you're not as streetable. So I do a lot of hydraulic roller engines, which I just did one recently. But now you can use those heads. If you have 70 heads and it's a 400, that opens up a big can of worms. Let me think about 71. Even at 71, you need to identify your heads to see if they're screw-in stud or press-in stud. If you have press-in studs, get rid of the heads. Not worth the money. Because you can buy a set of 6X heads very cheap, which are 76 to 79, 400 heads. You'll end up with 91 compression with that setup, and it's perfect for pump gas. The exhaust would be your other big deal. A lot of people do all this work and end up putting manifolds on the motor and non-manual vent exhaust in your So you have to do your complete combination. And on your tri-power, what year tri-power is it?
I don't have the tri-power.
Okay, so you want to get a 66 tri-power. That's got the larger center carb. In my shop right now, I'll be right with you. In my shop right now, I did an engine for a guy. It's a 64 GTO 389. He wanted 500 horse. And you can do that with the smaller cubic inch, but it becomes unstreetable because you got to build the compression. You got to have this crazy cam. And most people do not want that these days. They don't want to sit there and not idle and load up, and, you know, they want it to go like this. So on this 389 I did, I stroked it with that Eagle crank. I put ARP studs in. We use big block Chevy rods, so some people are like, oh, no, you're putting, it's like, it's disconnected.
It's an aftermarket rod.
So, but, you know, nobody sees it. Don't tell anyone if that bothers you. The reason that it's so good, and Jim Butler had a lot to do with this. He worked with Eagle, and we're friends. I sell to them and buy from them with the other big companies out there too. I buy from Kaufman's, I buy blocks, whatever. Anyway, on the 389, I boarded stroked that to a 455 cubic inch 389, and every nut and bolt is original tri-power. But it ended up being almost $13,000 for this engine. It was, I had to port, not only port the heads, but they were press-in studs, and I had to get those converted to screw-in studs. I mean, that process alone was like $400 in machine work. And then, of course, I'm also building this motor, so this guy wants to beat on this thing, and it's not going to blow up, of course. So it ended up, the guy ended up losing the car. Now I own the engine now. So he ended up getting out. It's been in my shop for 6 years. I've had a few like that. So that's the pains of the engine builder. And I'm sure there's body guys and restoration guys that can attest to that.
What do you see as the weakest spots in the Pontiac V8?
It's a great question. There's several weaker spots, and it's like I said, it's the whole picture. So one of the things on the bottom end that I concentrate on, if I'm building a performance motor, I don't use factory main cap bolts. I use ARP studs, which will clamp and hold that. You want to have your home where your crankshaft is turning perfect. Of course, the oiling, I actually make a crank scraper, so that goes across the whole area, and that keeps the oil down. So oil is number one. We have found, and there's a couple guys that will argue with me, 800 horsepower for a factory block, regular block, not a Super Duty block or some of that exotic stuff. That's about the threshold before you crack it. My dragster that I ran was blown alcohol, and I only ran factory blocks in that. So I got to really see, and I did over 1,000 horsepower. But I would get about 300 runs before I cracked the block at the number 2 main bearing is the weak spot. And I think it has something to do with the crankshaft. You know, where that position is. And every motor I take apart, the number 2 main always comes out a little easier, while the other ones I have to struggle to pull out. So block-wise, crankshaft and rod. Rods are the number 1 if you're doing a 455. I will not build one with stock rods. I just won't do it. It's not worth my reputation, especially with the price of connecting rods and going down. When I first started building motors, I met Nunzi, and I met Biondo, these racers out in New Jersey and all. And like Crowell was the only company where Super Duty, the factory Super Duty rods, and you were spending back then $1,000. And now that's the other thing that's made us more competitive in the race world and in the factory, even performance street cars, is the prices have gone down with mass production.
Talking to people, a lot of concern, particularly with the temperatures getting so hot.
Yes, great question.
I've got a 59 Bonneville with factory air, and we're living in Florida, so.
Real hot.
Yeah. Now, I've used a temp gun on the engine in stock, a tripod, and it runs around in between 200 and 210.
Okay.
Now, looking at the manual, it says the idiot light doesn't go on until 240.
That is correct.
And
Why do you think they call them idiot lights?
So I put a digital gauge on, which drives you nuts because the thing goes from like 195 up to 210, 210, you know, lots of time. But double question: what really is a safe temperature for those stock motors?
It's a great question. I'm glad you
Well, the
covered
second
this.
part of that is, I've had a lot of people tell me that timing, distributor curve,
Correct.
there's other things you can do.
Yep.
And I use Evans cooling and that.
So you got the best stuff in there. Yep.
So anyway, that's my question.
It's a great question, and I kind of went off a little bit with compression also, that many of the people are driving cars that are built from 1970 and earlier, and if your engine is stock, you have too much compression for today's high test. And heat is a huge deal with knocking and detonation. So you can run, you'll have guys that'll say, yeah, my engine's stock and it's 10-to-1 compression. Well, they'll all say 10.5-to-1 because that's what Pontiac put down. None of those engines are 10.5-to-1 because none of those engines have the piston all the way at the top. So compression has to do with how far your piston's up and down. I have seen and pulled apart motors that the piston was down 40 thousandths. That's absolutely terrible on one side, and it's 20-some thousandths on the other side. So one side of your motor is 9.8-to-1 compression, and the other side of your motor is like right around 10-to-1. And one of the things I do is square deck, and all the pistons are exactly the same. So I wanted to talk about that real quick. And if you have 10-to-1 compression, you really should be putting some type, especially in the heat. And what I can do, since I've disassembled so many engines, what I see from a detonating motor is the rod bearings at the very top of the connecting rod, they're pounding because when you detonate, it's firing when it doesn't want to. So that piston's getting the brakes put on. And what it ends up doing is, you'll see copper at the top of that rod area. And it's only a matter of time before destruction because it's not a happy engine. So it's cheap to put octane boost or race fuel in. It's expensive to get an engine built. So your heat, believe it or not, at 210 degrees is fine. A lot of people think you're overheating, and you're really not. Don't go above it though. So,
What about timing in that?
so your timing, a lot of people never, when they're looking at their engines and they're timing their engines, they're going by factory spec when you're idling. And you should really not pay attention to that. You want to know what your total timing is. So what total timing means is when you rev your engine up to 3,000 RPMs, your advanced weights, your vacuum advance, everything is now full. And you want to know, and the number, and you can either write this down, is 35 degrees is the magic number. If your engine goes to 40 degrees, you can blow a head gasket. I mean, timing is everything. So one of the most important, I'm glad you brought it up, it's one of the most important things. Now, a lot of you people, if you're driving and you're really not beating on your car and you're idling and all, it's not as a big effect. This is high RPM. This is beating on it, you know, or bringing your engine up to a higher RPM is where it's so important to have the right octane, the right temperature. Heat is a killer.
Is it
So
better to retard your spark?
that will actually make you run hotter.
Retarding?
Yeah, and that's one of the problems that's going on in the world, is people retard their timing to adjust for the octane. So you're losing power and you're causing more heat. And I can tell you how I found this out the first time. I fired an engine. I have a test stand, so I run every engine on my stand. And you're willing to watch it, you just have to join Facebook and just under my name, Paul Spots. So I put all my engine builds on Facebook, and the guys that I build motors for love it because they get to watch their engine get built. So it's kind of neat. Plus, it also shows that what I charged you for, there it is. So there's some people that I heard do some shaky things. Anyway, I fired a motor up once, and I didn't have the timing set right. And actually, this was on a dyno too. And all of a sudden, the exhaust manifolds glowed in a nice bright cherry. And I'm like, oh my God, what did I do wrong? And here, it was 10 degrees off. So when you have your timing and your timing is set, you advance your timing. So you need to throw that spark before the piston. It needs to ignite that. So that's why your timing is always advanced. Well, if you slow that process down, and now your piston's already been up, and all your combustion's in there, and you start firing that too late, in other words, retarded timing, you're transferring all that heat onto your exhaust side. So you'll burn an exhaust valve, you'll overheat that way and cause that damage.
Question on the heat.
I'll look over here next, I'm sorry.
Question on the heat. In your experience, how do you check top dead center with the engine assembled?
Yep,
To check your balancer?
that's a great question.
How do you do that?
Dial indicator. So
How do you get it done into the spark
it'll go
plug?
through the spark plug hole, because I've done that.
I was just
oh my
wondering-
God, I forgot to check the balance.
Yeah.
So,
I was just wondering how other people
Yeah.
did it. I've done it really backyard ways, and I was just wondering.
there's a lot of ways to do it, but the most accurate way is on a dial indicator, it's too short.
Yes.
Well, they sell, and it's very inexpensive. I go through MSC, which is in Harrisburg. There's another company, Granger, and they sell dial indicator extenders. And the little tip of that dial indicator unscrews, and you can put one on about that long. Then you'll need a contraption or a magnetic dial indicator stand, and you basically go through number one spark plug.
Have you done it other ways?
I've done it, that's a great question. I know you're gonna tell me how you did it, but I might beat you to it. But how did you do it?
I used a straw one time with a mark on it. Then I used a screwdriver to spare the moment. I had nothing else. I was really worried about the screwdriver.
Unfortunately, it's, when you're talking thousandths of an inch to know if your balancer's off, I mean, you're getting, at that point, you're just not really.
Yeah.
And if you are off on a balancer, first of all, that's extremely rare. Most balancers, except you gotta be careful with some of the overseas reproductions and stuff like that. I do stick to a couple of balancers. For the longest time, I was getting them from GM. They were really inexpensive. The good news on the early people, the 67 and earlier balancers, which are the two-part, AIM sells the one, I forget who the manufacturer is, and it's accurate. That I've never had that off. So, but they have straw, I think it's pretty cool. like that. Yes, sir.
Adrian, actually, my question about the most basic lifeblood of an engine, about oil.
Yes.
Especially like, well, I mean, it's not a Pontiac, but I have a car, for example, where my owner's manual and the original specifications call for synthetic blend oil. And my dealers agitate, oh, you should be using full synthetic, and so I'm curious, is he
It's a great
just
question.
charge more for a can of oil, for a can of oil, because I'm always checking my oil and I change it pretty religiously for the mileage. And secondly, also, the idea is that, if you had a very old car where it's just like straight weight oil, what do you do about multi-viscosity? What do you do about the fact that, for example, maybe the grades that were recommended in the owner's manual are not available anymore, or your mechanic wants to steer you to grade? I mean, in an older car, I have my mechanic actually using Rotella diesel oil.
Yes, I used to use that.
Like I said, it's unexpected. I was normally just using.
It's a great question. I'm glad you brought it up. Unfortunately, I can't answer it since it's not a Pontiac engine. No, I'm kidding. So, because everyone's like, oh my God, it's serious. As a Pontiac guy, it's just one of my sticks. So, anyway, it is a great question. Back in the, I want to say, the early 2000s, all the oil manufacturers pulled the zinc out of the oil because the OEMs of all of our new vehicles needed to extend warranties on the catalytic converters, and the zinc makes a catalytic converter. Now, I'm not sure about the newer cars right now. So what they did was they reduced all the zinc of all the oils. So if any of you people have a flat tappet can, which I'm sure almost all of you do, you have to make sure you have zinc in your oil, either an additive or putting in a race oil. The Rotella D, because diesels didn't have catalytic converters, still allowed the zinc. So that got out there for engine guys like me to start using that oil. And the problem with the diesel oil is it doesn't have the other additives that you need that a gas engine has. So that oil does not last. So if you do use that, you need to change it much quicker. Or like 2,000 miles, just don't use it. There's so much better stuff out there, it's not worth using anymore. So, what was the other one? Oh, so the other thing that's even more important is the oil filters. They are garbage oil filters. You go to Walmart and you go get a Fram or one of these other oil filters, and they're all designed for modern oil. What happened is our engines got newer, and like I told you earlier with the engineers, they use weights that are almost thinner than water. It's because the thinner the oil, the more efficient an engine is. All the new engines have no metal to metal parts. They don't need the zinc. Our Pontiacs, even with a roller cam, I still recommend my customers put in a zinc oil because the cam thrust plate is rubbing. Every cam thrust plate I take out of it is worn. The distributor gear is metal to metal. Guys that will wear out a distributor gear. So, for your question, my favorite oil, another Pennsylvania connection, is Brad Penn.
Right.
It's made up in Bradford, Pennsylvania. It is the only U.S.-based, for now, I mean, I haven't looked this fact up, so if anyone fact checks me and goes on the internet and says I don't know what I'm talking about, I would really not appreciate doing that. Anyway, that was the only, for at least for many years, the only US-based oil, because all the refineries, all the oil companies are buying foreign oil. That may have changed, but for now, from what I heard, that was the only US-based oil. And the US, oil is different in all different parts of the world. So we have in Pennsylvania, one of the things that made the Pennsylvania oil the best. You're talking, none of this is true now. All these oil companies today are names. Nobody except Brad Penn uses Pennsylvania grade base oil. So Pennzoil from Pennsylvania was one of them. Kendall, Wolf, Who else? You guys are really into this. Quaker State, thank you. How could I forget Quaker State? Paraffin is like a wax. So people would pull the valve cover off. Oh, I got this new Pontiac, I just got this old Pontiac, and I'm gonna check the engine out. They pull the valve cover off, and it's sludge city. Oh, this thing's no good. Guess what? That's all paraffin, it's fine. It actually sometimes helps because it puts all the oil back down into the oil pan. So people that thought sludge was this bad thing, of course the companies then would use that as marketing, and we have this additive and this cleaner and everything. So for you, with your straight weight, I have an old boat, and it calls for straight 30 weight, and I put 2050 in it. So your oil has to do with your temperature, your filter. You want to use always a good filter. Napa Wicks, Napa Gold, Wicks, K&N are the 3 filters I use. And I have a Pilot NOS AC Delco. None of the filters are made in the US anymore except those that I mentioned.
What about synthetic?
I'm a big synthetic, but the Brad pen that I like is part